Welcome to the Athletes First Performance Podcast. This podcast is focused on providing evidence-based information for human performance and sports medicine professionals. Episode 29 of the Athletes First Performance Podcast. Today, we're talking about injury risk profiling with the goal of discussing a framework for the development of a pragmatic and evidence-based screening tool. Before we kick this off, I don't think there's any one system or metric that can fully predict or prevent injuries. But our goal as sports medicine and human performance professionals is to try to mitigate as much injury and risk as possible using good training methods and proper assessments and screening tools to try to develop a baseline and prepare the athlete for training and their sport. So what's the overall scope and ambition of injury risk screening? So one is to identify areas of weakness or pain associated with performance to provide a platform for injury risk management. It's also to assess physical performance capacities such as movement, range of motion, strength, power, aerobic and anaerobic power, and speed. It's also to develop certain benchmarks. So what is normal for the athletic population that you're working with? And also being able to base that off of age, gender, or position. And then from an injury standpoint, we can use the assessment of recovery from previous injuries when there is that previous baseline. So when an athlete's returning to sport or competition, we have their previous baselines, and we can make sure that we're achieving a better outcome than what they had prior to their injury. And then last is just making sure that they're ready for the training or the sport that they're about to partake in or start. So make sure that they have all the technical and physical capacities to be able to benefit from your coaching or training program. How do we actually develop a screening tool in an evidence-based and pragmatic way? So first is just creating a generic warning index. So what this is just focusing on the sport as a whole and profiling the injuries that occur in that sport to help us determine and highlight the areas that we need special attention to. So if we stick with soccer, we know that there's high amount of knee injuries, ankle injuries, and hamstring injuries. And based on that sport, we can go look at epidemiological studies to look at two specific factors. So the injury incidence. This is often expressed as the number of injuries reported per 1,000 hours of sport or training. And then the injury severity. How many games or training days are missed due to that specific injury. And we can also look at the specific injury patterns based on several factors. Understanding the different age, gender, and competition levels of the specific sport that may have different specific injuries that are accompanied by those intrinsic risk factors. We also need to look at position specifics. In professional football, offensive linemen versus running backs have different injuries. In baseball, pitchers and outfielders have specific injuries. So we need to be able to just break down the overall sport, break down positions, age, and try to make it as specific to the athletic population that you're working with to get the best data available. So that's the creation of the generic warning index. Next is the individualized warning index. So this takes a look at the intrinsic risk factors or those that are internal to the individual. And those intrinsic risk factors can be broken down into modifiable versus non-modifiable. So non-modifiable risk factors are things that we can't really change. So we can't change age, gender, or their previous history of injury, even though that is the most powerful predictor of future injury. Modifiable risk factors are things that we can influence or change with training, such as strength, movement patterns, range of motion, and skill-specific tasks. Advantage of the warning index is that research can be directed to examine the modifiable risk factors that relate specifically to the injury of greatest significance to the athlete. Number three is combining the generic and individualized warning index to determine the risk factors for that specific injury. So we'll take hockey, for example. We know that there's a lot of hip injuries in hockey. So we need to prioritize those modifiable risk factors to injuries found in steps 1 and 2. So for hockey hip injuries, things that we need to be able to assess are hip range of motion, hip abductor to adductor strength ratios, and so on. For hamstring injuries, we need to be able to assess hamstring muscle strength, hip and hamstring mobility, and exposure to high-speed running. And then once we can determine the risk factors for the generic and individualized warning indexes, we can select the appropriate assessments of injury susceptibility. So these screens or assessments need to be specific to the athlete as well as being valid and reliable. So validity means that the results of the test are accurate indication of the variable being investigated. And reliability is defined as the results are robust enough against random error and will be the same when repeated by the same or other practitioners. Step 5 is assessment of movement proficiency. So I think this is good for any population. We need to understand their biomechanics and proper movement patterns in regards to being ready to train and ready to perform in their sport. So these movement proficiencies can test for injuries that are identified in the injury specific warning index, as well as key tests in the generic warning index. Number 6 is assessing and reviewing the results. So assessing the risk and highlight the areas that require further investigation. And the value of the screen is to act as a filter where risk factors for injuries in the warning index display deficits that can be deconstructed to the individual body regions or parts. Members of the high performance team can develop a plan of action to address these modifiable risk factors. Next is review. So determining when and how often this screening needs to take place. So often these screens are performed when a new athlete enters the team, mid-season, postseason, and sometimes even performed in the mid-season. And depending on the technology available, screening can take place on a weekly or even daily basis. So it really just it depends on the athletes that you're working with, the types of equipment that you have, the tests and screening profiles that you feel like are appropriate for your sport. Just making sure that you're being able to properly assess and use the data in a meaningful manner so that you're not giving athletes testing fatigue. If they repeatedly do the same test without any influence on their training, they're going to be sick and tired of that, and they're not going to find value in that. So being able to appropriately demonstrate the value of your screening and to show that what you're actually measuring is influencing your program on that individual athlete or team is going to make the most meaningful impact on those athletes and the coaches as a whole. So these are just my quick initial thoughts on injury profiling and screening. So if you have any additional comments, thoughts, or insights, be sure to reach out and let me know.